Okay, so to finish up this chapter, let's talk about the tools that you can use for penetration tests. This is There's a lot more detail here in the textbook than there are on the slides here. There's actually just this one slide left. So let's talk about kind of how we want to approach this. If you are prepping for the PenTest Plus certification, there are tools that you should be familiar with, and the book has a list of those on page 18 to 19. It's table 1.1. And we need to have just sort of a passing familiarity with those if we're going to take the PenTest Plus test. So some of that's going to be how to use those tools, and some of that is going to be, well, if I give you something that's say Y-Fight, what is that? Is that something? What could that be used for? And so the book lists some of these, and there's some questions on the homework about that. Let's talk just briefly about the sort of things that they do, and then we will call it a day, at least for this chapter. So there are tools that can be in reconnaissance, and some of those are things that we have actually used in the first half of this class. NS lookup and whois and some of that stuff. Maltego is something that can be used for this, but these are tools that can be used just to sort of get publicly available information, or to organize or display that information in some way. So vulnerability scanners here are also something that we've used in the first half of this class. Nessus and OpenVAS are ones I think that we talked about, and that you could run under Kali if it's something that you want to play with. But those are ways to gather lists of vulnerabilities on potential targets out there, and so that's something that gets used pretty heavily during this as well. There are some social engineering tools that the PenTest Plus will want you to be familiar with, and I think the Social Engineer Toolkit is the only one that we've talked about so far in this. I think we talked about that sometime last semester, but social engineering is something that you actually don't need any tools to go out there and do. That's the sort of stuff that we talked about last semester, where if you just call somebody up and say, "Hey, I'm from Microsoft. I need you to give me access to your computer." That's the sort of social engineering thing that we've talked about up until this point. Credential testing tools are ways that you can try to compromise somebody's password. These can be like reverse engineering of hashed passwords, or tools that are attempting to guess somebody's passwords in some way. The book has a list of those as well. Debuggers are things that will allow you to sort of reverse engineer software. There's a couple of those that you should be familiar with, and we'll get to those in Chapter 9. Software assurance has the same sort of thing. That's something else we'll talk about in Chapter 9. It's a way to software assurance is generally a way of trying to make sure that software is written to certain standards, and if you know what those standards are, it's going to help you exploit it in some way. Network testing is something that we've done, and I think if you've used Wireshark, you probably are aware of what that looks like, and that there's some tools that can be done for wired or wireless network testing there that are things that we'll talk about a little later in the course. Remote access is basically any sort of software that allows you to control a computer from somewhere else. I think probably within the Linux world, SSH is the most common example of that. There's some other things too. And exploitation is the way you're actually going to compromise systems. And escalate privileges on systems that you've compromised. Metasploit, which we talked about briefly in the first half of this class, is probably the most famous example of that. So That's about all we're going to do for chapter 1. This is probably a little bit shorter than they're going to be, but this is just an introductory chapter. So if you haven't already, please read it. If your textbook is still on the way in, you should be fine. You'll have plenty of time to get caught up. But go ahead and start thinking about the homework, participate in the discussion boards, and if you have any questions, let me know, and we'll figure out how to get you what you need. Thanks.